Thank you. And I would be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for the prison ministry. If we could give you the feeling of what it's like to look at somebody who was a murderer, a thief, rapist, and now see them give a prayer, read scripture, it is truly an unmatchable feeling to know that God can take such a sinner and save them. And then I realize, wait, that's what he did for me. I don't have to be a murderer to still be lost. So if you have any inkling towards prison ministry, Bill, Rick, or Frank, who's our newest, not soon, for much longer, we've got 3 new candidates that are going to be going through the training, but Frank is our newest volunteer. Go up and talk with them. Ask them how you can join or what you can do. We definitely need some more people. I like to try to get us to the point where we're doubled up with each of our teams, so that way if somebody's sick or on vacation, it's not a huge headache for the schedule maker. That's me. But it is truly a blessing to be in part of that ministry. Okay, 2 quick things, and then we'll get started. 1, young people. I know what it was like to be young, even though I don't look it anymore. So, you have a task. Grab something to write with, grab something to write on, and you are going to be tasked with keeping track of the number of times I say the word Peter. Okay, now don't start until I tell you to start. We have 2 official judges. Mr. Bryant, who is going to be HVA's valedictorian of the senior class here in a few weeks, is going to be one judge, and his dad, Corey, is going to be the other. So we'll see how well they can do at keeping track of the number of times I say Peter. Not yet. And when we're done, after church, you can go up, and if you're pretty close, if you're off by a couple, we'll forgive you. Corey has something to give you, young people, for keeping track of how many times I say a certain word today. The other thing I want to say real quick is, does everybody have a sermon outline? It's going to be a little difficult if you don't have a sermon outline. If you don't, raise your hand. I don't know where our deacons got to, because they have our extra copies. But if somebody can go grab a deacon, if you didn't get a sermon outline, raise your hand and we will get you one. So I do see a lady in the back with her hand raised, so I don't know where our deacons went, Corey, but they have my extra copies. Okay. All right, so young people, we are now ready to begin. So from now on, if I say a certain name, make a little tick mark or a number or something you can do to keep track of it. We're going to be in the book of John this morning, John chapter 21. My sermon title is The Miracle of Blank. Let's see if we can fill in that blank before the sermon is over. Peter had a humbling experience in the hall of the high priest. Around a fire, he not only denied his Lord, but he swore an oath to God that he did not know that man. And as that cock crowed, and as Christ turned and looked at Peter, Peter's heart was broken. And he left, and Peter went back to Gethsemane. And Mrs. White says he found the very spot where Christ had prayed. And there he poured out his heart to God. He had gone through the agony of Gethsemane, through the agony of the trial, through the agony of the cross, and then the adulation of Easter morning, of Christ rising from the dead. As he and John raced to the tomb, there's a famous song by Don Francisco that says, John ran on ahead, but John was scared to go in, and Peter, being the older, went into the tomb and saw it empty. Christ did appear to them after the road to Emmaus. And then Christ kind of had things he had to take care of. And some days went by, and he told them that after the Passover he would meet them outside of Jerusalem. So Peter and 6 other disciples were making their way along the shore. And as night began to fall, Peter said, "I want to go fishing." You see, Peter was at a crossroads. Peter had had an enormous event take place in his life, and he didn't know what the outcome of that event was going to be. So Peter did what most of us should do, and it's number 1 for you adults in your handout. When life hits you hard, go back to your roots. When life hits you hard, go back to your roots. Where was Peter most comfortable? Fishing. What was Peter and Andrew by trade? Fishermen. James and John, fishermen. And so we see in chapter 21, it says, Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee and 2 others of his disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We are going with you also." They went out and immediately got into the boat that night and caught nothing. Peter had been shaken to the very foundation. He had said, "I will never forsake you. Though all may leave you, I will never leave you, Christ." Peter had shown his dedication in the garden when he whipped out his military sword, which he had no clue how to use, and took a wild and crazy swing and only caught the ear of Malchus. But, to Peter's credit, he was the only one of the 11 who stood up that night for Christ. But then in a few short hours, he was swearing to God that he did not know that man Jesus. Core beliefs, number 2, your first 2 blanks there, folks. Core beliefs are the bedrock of a person's life. Without them, we're just playing in the water. All night they fished and caught nothing. But they did something as they fished. They talked about Jesus. And as they talked about Jesus, it began to hit home to Peter that he had a problem. You see, none of the rest of them in the boat had denied Jesus. They had fled, but they had not denied the one they called the Messiah. And Peter had. And as the night wore on, this feeling, Mrs. White tells us in Desire of Ages, chapter 85, it can be your afternoon reading, it's a relatively short chapter. But there was a disconnect now. Peter had always been looked at as what? As the leader of the disciples. It was always Peter who was going 100 miles an hour, oftentimes in the wrong direction, but he was always going somewhere, doing something, saying something. And now, that voiceful leader, that gregarious character of the Bible, didn't know where he fit in. Was he still a disciple? Did they look a little differently at him now? Maybe Andrew said where to throw the net the next time instead of Peter. You see, this disconnect had come because Peter had physically separated himself from Christ through his denial. And while Peter was broken in Gethsemane, he was broken alone. The other disciples were not there. They did not witness. And so there was this disconnect between Peter and the other 6 in the boat that night. And it was apparent without a doubt. But still, they talked about Jesus. Number 3, when you have a problem, find a true friend and talk about it. your 3 blanks there. When you have a problem, find a true friend and talk about it. See, Peter desired nothing more than to be accepted again by his fellow peers. And that night, as they talked and they talked about Jesus, Peter could feel the emotions. He could feel the distrust. He could feel the question mark coming from each of those other 6 men in that boat. They couldn't deny who he was, but they couldn't deny what he had done. Morning comes on, and they had caught nothing. And in verse 4 it says, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, "Children, have you any food?" They answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." And they cast, and now they were not able to draw in the net because of the multitude of fish. And I love John. John never calls himself by his name in the book of John. He always calls himself by the disciple whom Jesus loved. Wow. Pretty good title to give yourself. But it was true. And suddenly, a memory, in the pre-dawn darkness, a memory shines forth in John's mind. And he looks at Peter and he says, "I know that saying. I've heard that saying before. Peter, it's Jesus." See, if you look in Luke chapter 5, at the beginning of the ministry, Jesus plays this little, quote, game with the disciples. They had fished all night, caught nothing, and now he calls out, "Cast your net on the other side." And John remembers it. And he knows that voice. And he says, "Peter, it is the Lord." So number 4, who recognized the beach walker? John. The rest of them, 4 of them should have, because they were in the boat with John back in the beginning of the ministry. This is an interesting next verse. And I'm going to pick on somebody I don't know, but sir, you're pretty hard not to see in a church setting. You're pretty physically fit and you're pretty tall. So I'm going to make this gentleman here be Peter. Yes. Peter does something unique. You see, when you fish at night, you don't want to get your clothes dirty and smelly, so you take your coat off and you do your fishing in your undergarments. Now, that still happens today. My mom's going to be embarrassed, but my heritage is lobstering and fishing off the coast of Maine. And in the summertime, when it gets really hot and there is no wind out there, the lobstermen will fish in their underwear and in their t-shirt because it's hot. The sun is beating down on the water. You're working hard. What does Peter do? Verse 7. Now when Peter heard it was the Lord, he put on his outer garments, for he had removed them, and plunged into the sea. Now, Peter wasn't wearing a Speedo and put on, the neoprene skin they now use when they swim in the Olympics that got outlawed because it made them look like a dolphin and swim like a dolphin. I need you to stand up for a second. Okay, here's Peter. Now, ladies, how many of you have a fluffy, thick bathrobe at home? Raise your hands. Okay, or men. I have one. Okay, that bathrobe weighs a couple pounds, right? But what if you soak that bathrobe in the bathtub and then pull it out and put it on? How much does that weigh now? A lot. So here's Peter. Peter's going to put on a bathrobe and jump in to the sea. Thank you. You can sit down. Unless you can do the Australian crawl in 35 seconds down the pew. Peter jumps in with his clothes on, and it says they were about 200 cubits, which would be about 300 yards, which is the length of a football field. So start swimming with now about a 15-pound weight strapped to your body, not just one spot. And I know you're military, so I'm sure you had to do something like this in your lifetime. but a heavy, saggy piece of clothing draping into the water, cutting down your friction or increasing your friction as you swim. And Peter is not a wimp. That's what I'm wanting you to see here. Peter is a man's man. That was 2 Peters, by the way, in case you didn't get it. Now it's 3. Peter starts swimming to shore, leaving the other 6 to deal with this net full of fish. And he gets to the shore. And now what? Now I'm staring at the face of the one who the last words I said were, "GD it, I don't know him." And now I'm looking at him. And it hits Peter right between the eyes. I swore I didn't know him. And yet I just swam 100 yards through the ocean, and I'm standing in front of him. Why? You can see this battle. Peter so wants to be accepted again, but he doesn't know how to do it. So getting dressed and going swimming, Peter was no wimp. Swimming 100 yards in a bathrobe, you try it. Why count the fish? Notice in verse 8, it says, "But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, about 200 cubits, dragging the net of fish. And as they came to the land, they saw a fire of coals, and there the fish laid on it." And I lost my place. Verse 11, "Simon Peter went and helped them drag." We're going to back up, but I wanted to get to the number of fish. "And there were full of large fish, 153. Number 6, why count the fish? Who was going to take care of them in a few short days? Not the mob. Not all the people that were giving to Jesus' ministry. These men were going to have to buy their own food, buy their own clothes. Why did they go fishing in the first place? Yes, it was their living. They needed a job. And Jesus gave them a bountiful first night's harvest. So I think it's very interesting. Why count the fish? Because Christ helps us with our physical needs as well as our spiritual. Throughout his ministry, Christ had dealt with people's physical needs and then their spiritual needs. Which is easier, I say to you, to tell this man to get up and walk or to say that his sins are forgiven? But because I show you the power of the Father, I say to you, get up and walk, for your sins have been forgiven. Jesus took care of their physical needs. Okay, now we're going to back up. Peter's standing there on the beach. And Christ says, "Have you any fish?" And Peter goes, "Oh, yeah, a whole net." And so he runs back out. This is also an example of why Peter was no wimp. He grabs the net. Do you see that? It doesn't say all of them. It took 6 to get that net to the shore. It took who to get it up on the shore? What's it say? Go back. It says, "Then some of them came to land and saw the fire and coals and the fish laid on it. And Jesus said to them, 'Bring some of the fish which you have just caught.' Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to the land," or to land. Now I take my Bible literally. If it says, "Remember the 7th day," I take that literally. Why shouldn't I take the fact that Peter was strong enough to do what 6 men could do? Peter was no wimp. And I keep saying that because you're about to see how somebody who isn't a wimp doesn't have to become a wimp and stay a wimp to work for Jesus. This fire is the other problem in this story. John describes this fire. I'm going to reach into my pocket because it's in Greek, and I did not go to an Adventist university, so I did not take Hebrew and Greek. This fire is mentioned only one other time in the book of John. It's only mentioned one other time in the entire Bible. This fire is a literal recreation of the fire Peter stood at when he denied Christ. It is called an anthrakia. The emphasis is supposed to be in the last part. Anthrakia. An anthrakia. Everywhere else in the New Testament it's pyro, which we get pyrotechnics, fire. Here and in John 18, when he's been in 18, where he denies Christ and he's standing by the fire, there and here, only two places in the entire Bible. Now, you can say that's dumb luck. I say Christ has a point to make. He builds the same fire. This fire, an anthrakia, is a heap of burning coals. No flame, just the heat from coals, which you would use for cooking. When we go camping, what do? You make your fire, let the coals burn down, then you put your veggie dogs and your potatoes and everything else, and you cook. An anthrakia was prepared in the courtyard of Caiaphas. An anthrakia was built by Christ on the beach. Now, if John picked up that little hint, don't you think Peter picked up that little hint? And he stared at this fire, and he's staring at Christ, and he's staring into oblivion because he knows he's not supposed to be there. See, he's not a disciple anymore. What is he? Peter's a denier. We call it the doubting Thomas, but we never say the denier Peter. And they begin to eat, and Christ blesses the food and starts handing it out to them. And it says, so when they had eaten breakfast, notice this isn't a subtle little sidelight. They'd eaten. Fish and bread are gone. And Christ looks at Peter and says, Peter, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? Oof. Any other day of the week. 1 week ago, Peter would have said, Lord, I don't care how many men you stand up here. I'm your guy. And notice what Jesus slides into his sentence. Do you love me more than these? What's he trying to say? And Peter gets it right between the eyes. Notice his response in verse 15. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Period. End of sentence. No qualifier, no compare to him, and him. Absolutely, Lord. None of it. Lord, you know that I love you. A second time, Christ asks him, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Notice the change. No more comparison. Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Yes, Lord. You know that I love you. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep. The third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Notice the next three words. They are the key to this whole chapter. Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved. He was heartbroken. It didn't take 3 2x4s upside his head to figure out why Christ had asked once, twice, and now a third time. Peter was grieved. He was embarrassed. Why was Christ putting him through this? Number 7, what was the motive behind Christ's public humiliation of Peter? Did you ever think of that in this story? This is a public humiliation. Bryant, why did you miss the layup in the last game? I don't know, Coach. Bryant, why did you miss the layup? I don't know, Coach. Bryant, I'm asking you again, why did you miss the layup? He's embarrassed now. Look at him, he's turning red and he didn't even miss the layup. Christ publicly humiliates Peter. Why? Because Peter was desperate to answer the questions Christ asked. See, no longer did the public matter. Notice the first question, do you love me more than these? And Peter gives no qualifying answer. Lord, you know I love you. Christ is giving Peter the opportunity to undo the public humiliation he put on Christ just a few short days ago. Peter wasn't looking at it as a humiliation. We might. But he wasn't. He was wanting desperately. So why? Number 7, to give Peter a chance to publicly proclaim his love for Christ. To give Peter a chance to publicly proclaim his love for Christ. That's what Peter wanted. He was here. They were here. He desperately wanted to come back and be part of it. That's what he wanted. He poured his heart out in Gethsemane to God, saying, if I can only have one chance to show how much I loved him. Give me one chance, God, to show those that I truly do love him, that I don't deny him. And Christ gave it to him. Number 8, who benefited most from these 3 questions? A, B, C, or D? What do you think? All 3. All 3. Letter D. Jesus benefited because he had a specific work he needed Peter to do, but he needed to see that Peter was ready for that work. John needed to see Peter's public declaration for Christ so that John, who would become the writing side of the gospel, would know that Peter was truly committed to the work. And of course, Peter needed it because he had to be reclaimed as a disciple of Christ. Number 9, a walk on a beach is best done with a friend. Christ at this point says, Peter, follow me. We got to talk. And they start walking down the beach. And Christ gives Peter a vision of what the church is going to become in just a few more days after Pentecost. And he starts going through with Peter what he needs him to be for his ministry. And Jesus says to him, more assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you, and they will carry you where you do not wish. Every single living male Jew knew exactly what the phrase meant, others. Everyone of the Jewish race knew when somebody said somebody else is going to deal with you, it was only one somebody else, and that was the Romans. That was not lost on Peter. Jesus was telling Peter, you will follow me. See, Peter had said, I will follow you no matter what else everybody else does, I will follow you. And Jesus says, Peter, where I'm going, you cannot follow. Yeah, not now, but you will. Well, Peter didn't understand it then. So now Christ has to tell him again while he's walking on the beach. And for just a moment, the old Peter comes through. Because Peter's having to absorb all this. You mean I'm going to die on a cross for you? I can do that, Lord. But for just a second, Peter turns. And that old Peter comes through again as he sees John, beloved John, always in the shadows, but always where he needs to be. And Peter says, "What about him, Lord? Yeah, I'm a little bit nosy, Lord. See, if I'm going to be your lead man, Lord, I got to know what goes on with these other guys, Lord. And this guy, he's pretty special to you. What about him?" See, he didn't know that on the cross, he had told Mary, "Behold your son." See, John already had his job. John was going to be Christ's representative to mankind as not the replacement of Christ, but when they saw Mary, they would see John, and they would recognize John, and they would remember the cross. And so Peter says, "What about him?" And what does it say? Jesus said to him, "If I will that I have him stay alive till I come." What is that to you? Peter, focus. Focus. I'm trying to tell you what's going to happen, Peter. I need you to focus right now. What does it say? You follow me. Now I asked you a question this morning. Did John stay alive till he saw Christ come? Think about it. What do we have in the book of Revelation, chapter 20 through 22? Do we not see a city coming down? Do we not see a Savior coming back for his beloved? Now, did he literally see him? No, obviously not. He's in the grave, asleep. But he saw him in vision. So when Christ here, some people make light of this verse saying, well, see how Christ was flippant? Christ wasn't flippant. He was telling Peter, you have a job, and he has a job. His job will come long after you're dead. But he has a job to do. You follow me now. Today, Christ still needs Peters and Johns. Which are you willing to be? In just a few short weeks following this day on the beach, Peter stood in a city square and delivered the sermon of all sermons. I call it the second greatest sermon, well, the third greatest sermon ever given, the Sermon on the Mount. I put one sermon just slightly above Peter's sermon, and that's Stephen's. I love Stephen. And the sermon Stephen preached that day sealed the fate of the Jews. But in just a few weeks, Peter gives a sermon, and 3,000 people are converted that day. So that was his job. I need a mouthpiece. Peter, are you willing to be that? Are some of you willing to be that? Others need to be a John. We need to run it. We need to run the church. We need to take care of the church. We need to uphold the church. We need to be there for people in the church. Because usually the person that's up here doing this isn't the one doing what can I help with. So what are you today? The sermon has a blank. The miracle of, which word fills best? Fish, love, grace, commitment. Or I'm going to give you one more word as we close. Which word fits in best? How about the miracle of me? See, because you're going to be the ones writing that word in there. M-E. Remember, I started the story with the prison ministry. How can I look at a rapist or a murderer who is now singing songs that I sing every Sabbath, praying to the same God that I pray to every Sabbath. And I realize, oh, there by the grace of God go I. The miracle is me. There's such a screw up of a person here is asked the same question that a screw up in John chapter 21 is asked. Brad, do you love me? Danielle, do you love me? Justin, do you love me? Then follow me and feed my sheep.